Facebook Live. We're really excited to be spending some time with you. We're spanning a wide range of time zones today, almost 15 hours across us. And so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on where it is that you are located. This is the second dialogue in Jazz's Women Radically Transforming a World in Crisis series. And we really, really warmly welcome you and look forward to being in conversation with you today, and to flag that any comments or questions that you may have, we will be tracking in the chat, both on Zoom and on Facebook. So please feel free to engage with us through those functions as the dialogue unfolds. So welcome. I'm going to hand over to Paulina, who will be supporting us today with interpretation. So over to you, Paulina.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Interpreto los comentarios de Shireen. Bueno, les damos una cálida bienvenida a todas. Muchas gracias por unirse a esta llamada. Saludo a las que se han conectado por Zoom y por Facebook. Y les cuento que estamos conectadas con varias zonas de tiempo el día de hoy, con 15 horas de diferencia entre algunos lugares, y por lo tanto les digo buenos días, buenas tardes y buenas noches a todos los que nos escuchan. Les cuento que este es el segundo diálogo de nuestra serie y les doy una cálida bienvenida, y me gustaría avisarles que alentamos que escriban sus comentarios en el chat. Tenemos varias personas revisando el chat y nos gustaría mucho que interactúen con nosotras durante el diálogo. Muchas gracias.
Hi, everyone. This is Alexa Bradley with Jazz. And again, just to echo what Paulina said, we're about to get started. The interpretation will start shortly. We're really happy to be able to offer simultaneous translation. So thank you so much for helping us, Paulina. If you should look at the bottom of your screen there and you'll see the interpretation button. Is that right, Paulina? It's up now. And so if you should check and see, move your mouse on the screen, you'll see the interpretation button. If you should choose the language that you want to listen in. If you want to listen to English, you should click English. If you want to listen in Spanish, click Spanish. And if you are okay hearing either one, if you're bilingual, just leave it in off. And you'll want to leave the bottom button, which says mute original audio, just leave that off for now, and you can slightly hear the original language in the background, lets you know what's happening. Please, if you need any help with interpretation, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, we want to actually encourage you to use the chat throughout the dialogue today for both technical questions or interpretation support, and also to comment as a question or for any of us. If you're an attendee, you'll notice in the chat that you can select, if you're on Zoom, whether to comment to all panelists and attendees or all panelists. We encourage you to select all panelists and attendees, and that way everyone can see your questions and your comments on the chat. Just to share, we are also streaming this on Facebook, so thank you for those of us that are joining us by Facebook, and also hope you'll participate there in the conversation. We will share at the end of this conversation, we will be sharing highlights and resources that are shared on our Jazz website and in social media. We'll also be posting the recording of this, so you'll be able to share with others if they weren't able to make it today. Let's see, anything else? We have two Twitter hashtags we're using in English. Those are Shift the Power and Jazz Dialogues. We have them in Spanish as well. If you have other COVID-related hashtags in your context, feel free to use those as well. You will be able to turn on audio and video. We ask you to stay on mute and off audio during this so that we can all see the panelists. I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. We hope you really enjoy this and that you find this a rich contribution to the thinking that feminists are doing around the world about how we can respond to this moment of crisis and both to meet the challenges of the time, but also to seize the opportunities for bold and radical change. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexa. And so with that, the housekeeping taken care of, let us dive in. As Jazz, we are a feminist movement building support organization. We felt very strongly that in this time of COVID-19, it is critical to continue to find ways of creating space to hold political dialogue, to show solidarity, that can inform movement-based analysis, strategy, and action, while also amplifying the voices of women activist leaders who are on the front lines, because we know that it's there that the solutions and the most creative and sustainable solutions can be found in this world that we are experiencing as broken. And so this is one of many such spaces that Jazz is creating. And I say one of many because we are also very aware from our grounded movement building support in 3 regions, Southeast Asia, Central America, and Southern Africa, that there is differential access in terms of technology. And so alongside Wi-Fi based engagements or virtual engagements on these forums like Zoom and Facebook, we are also simultaneously harnessing the power of things like bulk SMS, WhatsApp as a means of continuing conversation, dialogue, radio, among a range of other mediums that we are experimenting with in this moment, to continue to connect and support community-led movements and formations at this time. And so today's dialogue, as Alexa said, is the second in our series of women radically transforming a world in crisis. Today we are focusing on what is broken in our world. I think this current pandemic moment is really revealing in glaringly obvious ways what is broken, what needs to change, and what is our work as people, as a community committed to social justice and social change, and what are the opportunities that this moment provides for building, organizing, and transforming power for a just feminist future. So our conversation will be pivoting around those key questions. And we really do have the gift today of being in conversation with 4 feminist activists, researchers, writers, scholars, organizers, with years of experience of supporting and doing movement work that spans the local to the global. And so I'd really like to warmly welcome, on behalf of Jazz and everybody who's joined us today, Alda Facio, who is in Costa Rica, Dina Lambontabing, who's from Indonesia, Isabella Matambanadzor from Zimbabwe, and Margot Okazawa Ray, who is from the US, but connected to a whole range of other contexts. We will post the bios of the speakers who are joining us for this dialogue on our website, so you can get to know them better. But today, I really want for us to have a conversation. And I'm going to facilitate this as though we are really sitting in a living room, although we are physically distanced. And I'd like to begin with the question. And I'm going to start with you, Alda. Given where it is that you are positioned, what is the current crisis, sort of propelled by this pandemic, revealing?
Perdón, todavía cuesta saber dónde es que están las cosas.
My apologies. I'm still getting familiar with the platform. Thank you, Shireen. It's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you. Now, to answer your question, I have a privilege to be able to be part of the working group of discrimination against women and children. And we have seen in that working group that the pandemic is affecting women all over the world. We have received communication and information from women from all regions around the world. And what we have seen is that this pandemic and the lockdown has led to more violence in relationships, more violence against women at home. We have also seen that women are suffering from a lack of access to the healthcare system. For example, for pregnancy issues, when women are giving birth, they're being administered drugs to hurry the birth, or there are women that have had to give birth on the floor or outside hospitals. This is a terrible situation. The far right and the fundamentalists are also taking advantage of this situation where abortion had been legalized. They're trying to criminalize it again. We've seen that happening in many different countries. Women were already suffering discrimination in different parts of the world. 70% of women in the world work in the informal sector. And as a result of this pandemic, they've been left without resources for survival. I'm going to stop here because I could keep talking about this for an hour, but that's just a brief summary of the things that we have seen.
Great. Thank you, Alda, for some pathways into this conversation. I'd like to turn to you, Dina. One of the things that Alda mentioned was, the intensification of fundamentalist agendas that are really impacting and shaping the responses and political positions that our states are taking. In Indonesia and in the region, what are you seeing with regards to those more conservative agendas alongside a range of other things?
Well, hi, good evening from Indonesia. I would like to see from other side, from the positive side first, because I could see in Indonesia that women become very visible because of their roles at home. Since our president make a decision that we work from home, a home is women's arena. That's really show the woman's leadership actually, which is quite good. And in another thing also, I would like to see the data. The data shows that more male in the case COVID than so almost 60% male got case infected by COVID, and only few women. I mean, lower than that. And for the deaths, even better for women. I mean, 65% male and 35% women. I would say that women more resilient than men, if I can see that. Then so far, what I would say is really show us the importance of health system and the success of women to really take care of health of the family from home. And in Indonesia, when we say home, it's various. I mean, we can also stay with a big family and others, maybe in big city. Some come from the small town that they study in a big city. So, I mean, this is really show the care economic actually on the hands of women, but it's true, invisible from the eyes of the authority, I mean, from the government. So I would prefer to talk about that first, and then maybe later on about fundamentalism, because fundamentalism is, well, it's a bit difficult to mention that area. It's a bit delicate issue for me. So maybe later on. So back to you, Shireen.
Thank you very much, Dina, for really putting a spotlight on, you know, how the current crisis is really revealing the centralization of care work and the fact that women are really on the front lines of that work from the home all the way through, you know, to community and public spaces in this moment. And I mean, we're seeing it across the board in terms of the sustaining of life and the mitigating of impact of the pandemic. Both Alda and you, Dina, you know, spoke about health and the differential impact, you know, in terms of accessing healthcare, as well as, you know, the role that women are needing to play as caregivers on that front. Bella, I'd like to turn to you, because in a country like Zimbabwe, where the health system has been eroded in many, many ways, what are you seeing in relation to what the current crisis is revealing in terms of health infrastructure, but also other impacts on the lives of ordinary women and people in Zimbabwe and in the region?
All right. Thank you, Shireen, and thank you to Jas for really bringing us together in this special way at this time where it's really heartwarming to have feminist conversations about what's going on in the world and to feel the feminist community this way. I think I want to begin by saying that this is where the patriarchal governance system has run aground, right? It's brought us to a cul-de-sac in terms of an imagination of our existence as human beings. And it's shown its shortcomings and its tremendous failures for the people of the world, whether they are male or female. We cannot continue with a patriarchal governance complex because it has shown itself to be insufficient and to be a failure. The second thing I think that's important for us to really talk about is, so where is society deriving trust? And for me, what's exciting is society is deriving trust from the women's movements, from feminist movements, because they've always known that feminist movements and women's rights movements show up in times of crisis, in times of need, and they show up reliably, effectively, efficiently. They show up with what I would say 360 degrees of solutions. So feminist movements are not only looking at healthcare, we're talking about, okay, what about access to water? What about the right to work? The right food, and what is vital about the moment that we're in. And where we are seeing feminist movements remind us that 25 years ago, at Beijing, for instance, we were talking about the need for important social welfare systems to remain intact and robust, to be able to fulfill the needs of all citizens, women in particular, girls in particular, but all citizens. And we've come to realize that what feminists have been saying for decades has come to pass. And it's a huge tragedy that it's come in this way. But really, I think it's also a moment where we should stand proud. And we should stand proud and say, we've done our work so effectively that if governments are listening, if the international global architecture of government is listening, they should turn to feminists for solutions.
Great, thank you for that, Bella. I mean, I think, you know, what I'm hearing is in this moment, we are really seeing the solutions coming from women community-based, from our movements, and from on the back of work that we have done over decades, right? Starting in 1975, I think it was, in Mexico, right, with the first World Conference on Women. And it's significant that, in this year, we are celebrating Beijing Plus 25, and revisiting these conversations and the agendas that have been laid out, but that have also been eroded systematically by a racialized neoliberal capitalism, that is leaving us vulnerable, as we are seeing in this moment. Margot, I want to turn to you. Many state responses in this moment have been to militarize the pandemic. And I think we're seeing that in a whole range of countries in different ways to varying degrees around the world. And so, turning to you, Margot, what for you is the crisis further revealing, given the levels of militarization that we have always lived with, but we are seeing being ramped up in very particular ways in this moment?
Yes, thank you very much for organizing this and having me on the panel. I want to just start by saying, Isabella, wherever you are, that's where I want to be. I think your idea of patriarchal governance run aground absolutely captures it. And I would add here that the patriarchal governance, particularly in the US, and I'm not sure how it looks in other places, maybe it's around ethnicity, caste, class, the patriarchal governance here that's run aground is absolutely also racialized. And so, I think that's an important piece I want to make sure to introduce to this conversation. So we're finding, for example, indigenous people, African-American people, incarcerated people who are majority are peoples of color, are facing the severest impacts of the pandemic. Yes, militarization. Let me just say that right now, the Philippines government and the US government are negotiating a $1 billion arms deal. Imagine spending in the Philippines $1 billion on arms when the situation, I think literally there, it's a lockdown situation. And when one considers that it's not just the Philippines, but many governments around the world are militarizing, even the language of, this war against the pandemic says quite a lot about the logic of how states are thinking about addressing this issue, right? So there's a notion of disaster militarism that women from the International Women's Network Against Militarism have put forward a while ago when there was a crisis in the Philippines and the US military intervened for humanitarian aid. And let's make no mistake about it, right? Wars and militarism kill people. The military are not trained to be humanitarian keepers, right? They're trained to kill, they're trained to dominate. And the US military spends half, of what the rest of the world spends on. The US spends half of the total military budget of the world, right? And so that's important. Also, that militarization takes the form not just of state militaries, but armed militia being out in the streets. We see that very clearly in the US, where recently there was a group of white armed men, visited the state house in Kentucky, showing their force. And so, particularly in the US, the military industrial complex also is an important part of the economic engine, right? And so the thinking about the relationship between militarism, religious fundamentalisms, and capitalism, I think is a very important bundle for us to consider here. And it's happening not just in the US, but it's happening in many places in the world. We heard about that in Germany, in South Africa. Pakistan, and so forth. And of course, Palestine.
Great, thank you, Margot, for putting that into the conversation. I mean, I think as we know, we are really sort of in a moment and getting a picture, you know, based on what it is that you have shared, of a world that really is putting power and, you know, elite political power, as well as economic interests, at the forefront over people and lives. And I think this is playing out in a range of different ways. And as power attempts to consolidate itself in a slightly different configuration, given this moment, we are also seeing a ratcheting up of levels of dehumanization, you know, in a range of different ways, that is both alarming and not what we want. That is not the world that we as feminists, you know, dream of or are trying to claim in this moment as part of our reality. It's tough, right? The last 2 months or the last 3 months that, you know, we've all been living through is tough. At a whole range of different levels, heart, mind, and body, we have things that are hitting us, right? In terms of our context, in terms of how our lives have been restructured, in terms of, you know, what it is that we are needing to think about, what it is that we are feeling, and how we sustain ourselves. Part of this dialogue series is about finding ways to sustain ourselves and our community to stay strong, to be in solidarity, and to push forward, given what it is that we are seeing in terms of what the crisis is revealing. I want to segue into the next question, and I'd like to do that by just asking you in 1 or 2 words to share what it is that is sustaining you in this moment, as we are all physically distanced, but, you know, trying to connect in different ways as part of social solidarity. So I'm going to do a quick round, 1 or 2 words. What in this moment, as you sit in your beautiful home spaces, and I see lots of books, so that's great. What is sustaining you? And we'll start with you, Alda, and then just do a quick round and then into our next question.
Gracias, Shireen. A mí lo que me...
Thank you, Shireen. What sustains me right now are all the expressions of affection and solidarity that I have shared with feminists from around the world. These are people who ask me personally how I'm doing, and also to know collectively that there is so much solidarity amongst people who are suffering, and that people who have very little resources, they're sharing their food, they're sharing whatever they have. That moves me very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Alda. Dina, what is sustaining you over there in Indonesia?
Yeah, as I work mostly at the grassroots level, I could see how what do you call it, amazing the initiative. Maybe government think that they are the woman, but some which is far more important. For instance, they work together to prepare sanitizer. They try to teach each other how to make hand sanitizer, disinfectant, you know, and then even to understand, to make people understand what is actually the real meaning of so many new terminology from our government, all in English. You can imagine. We actually talk in our local language, and then the second language is the national language. Maybe government say it's the first language, but in fact it's a second language. And then suddenly with lockdown, social distancing, so many new terminology that make people panic and even afraid to think about the COVID. So what could I say? It's like the why women really move to try to, from our popular education, to make people understand what is going on and what's our responsibility, and to be alert, and then let's do together what we can do. Maybe we can learn how to make a very good mask, and they distribute it well. Even in one place in Lampung, for instance, in the end of this island, Sumatra Island, they start to work through masks, and they work together with they call it young feminists. And then they send the mask to other just to make the let's move together. So I think the collective power is there, and they really try to work in a very good way of solidarity, sisterhood, and in the feminist movement, I must say.
Thank you, Dina. That's so important. So thank you for sharing that. Bella, in this moment, what is sustaining you?
Well, the community.
Yes.
And I really want to honor it. The feminist communities really hold me up in many ways. And I'm not only talking about, feminist communities I've come across through activism and work, but feminist communities in my family, right?
Yeah.
And I want to honor that as well. The other thing that sustains me is the knowledge that actually we have found solutions to many epidemics before. So although in this moment it's very dark and very difficult, I'm reminded of the activism of women in Liberia in the face of Ebola in the Mano River Basin. I'm reminded of the activism led by women in the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa on HIV and AIDS. I'm reminded around the activism we had in Zimbabwe on cholera. These are the epidemics that I've had most intimate experiences with. And together we found solutions to seemingly impossible situations. And that light, somewhere it's flickering within me. And I know that this will be something we speak about in the past tense one day.
Viva.
I love that.
Thank you, Bella. Thank you. Absolutely. Margot.
All the things that have been mentioned by the previous speakers. I'm also absolutely inspired by the women in Okinawa, the women in Palestine, the women in places that we often don't hear about struggling against amazing odds, and so that's one thing, the women's movement for sure. The other thing I'm particularly inspired by is kind of a willingness that I'm seeing among women in the feminist movement, among people in the other movements, but especially in the feminist movements, where we're asking different kinds of questions. We're not just going to, what do we do now? But for example, we're asking questions like, what really is our vision now? What are we trying to create, right? What are we not understanding, right? What of the things we think have worked in the past, right, are not really going to serve us now, because this is a whole different kind of situation that's global, right? It's not localized problems, right? And so the asking of deeper questions about the situation, also asking questions, things like, what does it mean to be human, right? What does it mean to be part of the system of all living things, right? And how do we come into right relationship with the whole environment and other people around us? Like the deeper philosophical questions that I think that are also emerging out of this pandemic are so profound, and to me, so inspiring. And the last thing that I'm inspired by is dancing every day, to great dance music. And I'm facilitating a transcontinental, transatlantic dance party. So if anybody's interested, email me and I'll give you the link.
Sorry, I was on mute. Before I move to the other panelists, I just wanted to ask you, I think taking a holistic approach to the meaning of change and the meaning of life is so fundamental right now, because I think one of the things that the development industry, with increasing intensity, did was it said, I will deal with your HIV/AIDS, but I'm not going to deal with your water issue, right? To bounce off the example that Bella gave. I will deal with the fact that you don't have a house, but sorry, I can't deal with food insecurity. Yeah, it fragmented women and women's lives, and that had a whole knock-on effect in terms of, you know, how we think about support, how we think about change, how we think about sustaining, you know, all of us in ways that promote life interconnectedness, and you know, the well-being of us all, including our planet. Margot, if you had to think about two key things that we need to hold as we think about our work going forward, as feminists, as activists, committed to a just future that holds in balance the interconnectedness of all of us, what would they be for you?
Most fundamental would be the love of life and love of all life. I think that has to be the primary kind of value that moves us forward. And of course, related to that is building sturdy relationships, new ones, reinforcing the ones that are already in place. Because I think, you know, we know now, right, that the tasks that we've done in the past, you know, we've made great progress and so forth. But especially when we think transnationally, when we think across various kinds of borders, it's the sturdy relationships among us that have really carried the day. And I think now is more than ever is the time to remind ourselves of that. And all of that has to be rooted in what I think about this a deep global, and global, I don't mean just geographically, but kind of more all-encompassing way to love one another and to love life, right? So love and sturdy relationships, I think, are absolutely fundamental in helping us move forward.
Great, thank you, Margot. Bella, I'm going to go to you next. What is this conversation and what is your thinking right now about our work? What is the work that we are needing to be doing for a just future going forward? Two points or two thoughts.
So Shireen, really, I don't want to say the name of the disease because it's part of my spiritual practice to stop giving that power by refusing to say the name of the disease. But what I'm noticing is that it's stretched every single aspect of our lives as we live them currently. It's stretched family, it's stretched community, it's stretched government, it's even stretched movements. And what I want to say is that we're in this moment where we need to rethink what movement. Because in some respects, we started to mimic the privatization of movements that we've seen in other spaces. And now we really have to build very deeply collective movements. And that's the beauty of the conversation that JAS is holding today, that you can hold a transnational global conversation, right, is an outcome of this challenge that we're facing. And we're learning from each other. And I think that's key. Being open to learning from each other is the other thing that I think is vital. And I think I just want to say it. I want to say that bourgeois solutions, elite solutions will not fix the problems of the world. They won't. Because when we think about things like lockdown, they work for a particular class of person and citizen, right? They don't work for the majority of citizens and people in the world. And this is what is being taken apart brick by brick. And I hope that what we are going to have is a very different architecture in terms of class, of how we coexist as citizens of the world going forward. And I'm really trying to hold on to that. The other thing that has been really re-illuminated is the volume of domestic labor that women carry. This has been re-illuminated. It is absolutely, to put men in lockdown with us, those of us who share our spaces with men for months on end, has meant that they can no longer say, we didn't know that this is what unpaid domestic care work looks like and feels like, the labor of it. And I think that this is the other thing that we've made a step forward on, in as much as there have been tragedies and difficulties.
Thank you.
I also want to offer something else, if I may, Shireen.
Sure.
I think, and I support what Margot was saying about, the problem of militarism in the world. It's one of these fundamentalisms that we really need to stand up against. Our governments have spent more on armies and on war than they've done on our healthcare, on our patient-nurse ratio, for example, on the salaries of nurses and the working conditions of nurses and doctors. And this has to be corrected in this moment. The conditions of what are being called the frontline healthcare workers need to be corrected right across the globe. And I think that's key going forward, the working class struggles.
Yeah, thank you, Bella. I mean, it is the thing that shall not be named, has served as a great leveler in many, many respects. Guess what we do with that now becomes the question. And Dina, you have given us clues in terms of what it is that we do with that. I think, your reflections on Indonesia and community-based organizing work is absolutely key in this moment, because as you said, Dina, when you started, right, this is the opportunity, because it is at community level where creative and sustainable solutions are being found. And, your reference, Bella, to the lessons that we can learn from community responses to Ebola, to HIV/AIDS, but even to protection and collective protection from violence, lies at community level. And so, Dina, for you to very briefly, share with us, what does our work for a just future going forward look like for you?
Yes, I will consistently say that give back the power to the grassroots level, because they are the one who really in the front line, who really got the implication. Imagine Indonesia will have a new debt again for England, from their friends, from the elite even. Who behind them, right? So I think there is a big need to really educate the people, criticize all is going on right now, even militarization, fundamentalism, and the power of capital, etc. So for me, feminist popular education is very important. And the second thing, basic needs is basic rights, and no elite in needs. All goes to basic, especially in this era of pandemic, and there are many things happen. I believe there is a long way to go, but I believe that women's power is there. As long as the government really see that woman actually has a good leadership, we can do better, far better even. No more patriarchal government.
Down with the
The
system.
whole word.
Down with the system, Dina. Because it's not serving us. So yes, I mean, I think what I'm hearing is actually everything has changed, but nothing has changed. Because our strategies in terms of feminist movement building, grounded by feminist popular education, consciousness raising, the reweaving and building of community, of building collective power, of solidarity or mutual aid, remains the same. Actually, it may take a different form given the challenges of the pandemic and what it is that we are needing to navigate in terms of health considerations, but in some way it remains the same, and that's really exciting. Alda, before I go to you, Alda, actually, I want to encourage people to, if they have questions for our panelists, to please put them in the chat. We have a team who are tracking questions, and we're going to try and field a few. But Alda, I know that you've spanned local to global spaces, including, given your work in the UN, and in the working group. What for you is our work going forward?
I did that. Es a riesgo de parecer pesimista
I don't want to come across as pessimist, and I completely agree with everything that everyone has said already. Yes, I think it's true to emphasize everything that we feminists have been saying, everything that we've been highlighting with regards to this situation. I also, though, think that it's important to speak about the power that the 1% is exercising. They are taking advantage of this moment to hyper-privatize what was already in the process of becoming privatized. So us as feminists, we're talking about collectives, working collectively, what Dina was saying about grassroots. While we're talking about those things, the 1% is taking over more control, more power, and privatizing even more. We saw it by Governor Cuomo's comments in New York. He said now even education in New York, even primaries, will be under the control of a millionaire who's the owner of a company. So of course, that benefits the people who have the control of technology, and this dehumanizes our communities. These people, these owners of these companies are not interested in humanity. What Margot was saying is that the most important thing is love of life. Now, what can we do to make sure that everybody feels that? I think that's the biggest challenge that we have as feminists. How do we work together so that the whole world not only feels love for life, but also understands how governments work? How structures work. And that's why I think that popular feminist education has a lot to offer in that sense, not only how to survive, but also understand how power works, how government functions. We have to make sure that leaders or supposed leaders in the world don't continue to do what they have been doing. We can't allow it. When I see what is happening in the United States with Trump, how can there be such an ignorant group of people? And I apologize for using that word, but how can that be possible? I do understand how that can happen, but what I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't allow it. We shouldn't permit it. We need to support so that more and more people understand that the privatization on behalf of the 1%, is something that can be changed. It's something that we will not allow. And that's why we need to dedicate more time to talking, speaking, and understanding about how governments work, how the United Nations work, even if it's a boring subject. It's important to know more about how these decisions are taken. And even though my friends in Central America will maybe oppose this, but Costa Rica, we have a different situation because we don't have militaries. Here, a very tiny country is showing that we can face this pandemic in such a different way compared to other countries, because we don't have a military force, we don't spend money on the army, we have a healthcare system that, yes, is also being privatized, but that more or less works, that the educational system more or less works, whereas in the rest of Central America, we see that the healthcare system doesn't work, the educational system doesn't work, but however, the military forces do work. They are well backed and well supported. So just to conclude, I think that this pandemic, specifically the lockdown, is showing us an opportunity to say that these positions of power, that this trajectory that the world had taken, the neoliberal capitalism, is not the only way, that there are other ways of living that are much more sustainable, that are much more loving towards life.
Thank you, Alda. I think you put on the table the counterpoint. So if strengthening community-based leadership, activism, and building collective power is a solution, how it is that we understand power and how it is that power is reconfiguring and consolidating itself in this moment in terms of both political elites, our states, as well as those actors with hidden interests, including pharmaceutical companies, including mining companies, including, the billionaire, the 1%, as you say, who are potentially making money from the pandemic, I think is really, really key as part of thinking about strategy, as well as our tactics and actions in doing the work for a just future, because it is that analysis and reading of power that then allows us to better target our actions, as well as plan for safety, because we are not on a level playing field right now in terms of the meaning of violence, right? And how it is that structural violence is also playing out by denying people access to the things that they most need. So, rounding people up and putting them in camps that are akin to concentration camps is not a solution necessarily. Sheltering in place for people who don't have, homes or who are staying in sleep up areas necessary. And we hope that, in the series, we can really focus a dialogue on thinking through in a much deeper way, something that I think we're just scratching the surface on, which is about strategy and action, and how it is that we can strengthen ourselves, building, on what it is that we always know that Dina reminds us of, community-based agency and power, in order to make change happen. Thank you for that, Alda. I wanted to take, and it's not pessimistic. I think it's about being real. And as feminists, we need to be real, right? In terms of how it is that we think about our strategies and actions, including our alliances, as Margot reminds us, cross-border, so that the broadest set of us right now in order to push for the system to topple, which is the work of Femina. So we coming towards the end of our conversation, and there've been a couple of that my colleagues have been collating as one, which I think is critical in some way in moving us towards the end of this conversation. And station that involves around solutions and how it is that we can ensure that we don't go back to normal. And so it's pushing towards strategies and actions as well. But maybe as a closing round, how can our solutions matter and be seen in this moment? And let's start with you, Dina. So the question from the chat, how can our solutions matter and be seen? And I imagine that is also invoking the whole range of constraints that we have in terms of face-to-face work right now, etc. Dina.
Not easy question. I just think that we really need to change the narrative. There are so many things now flying around. And who looks the problem of health, it's on the hands of women. Actually, it's about the humanity. That government also, what do you call it, responsible. That the health is far more important than military expenditures, and also the system that women's access to contraceptive, to the abortion, sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is important, and the environment. So if I now, what do you want me to say? I just feel like so many things, so many new narratives. Many say that we need to adaptive to what? To patriarchy. And there's, what is normal for us as feminists, actually? There are many things to change. And we need to show off, to really show our work. What we have done in the grassroots level. Government should look at it as a one way also to really, what do you call it? Not to end, to respond to the, whatever the emergency situation. We can do that because I think the power of women, the power of grassroots people, the power of people, it's the main thing in the whole, in the globe. That's what I can say. And again, I would say that the importance of the awareness raising of our rights. Our rights as human, as women, as poor people, as people that with illness, even now, so many people are afraid of the pandemic, etc. Not only pandemic, actually even the general flu. So many people die, but not really, there is no a good response from the yeah.
Thanks, Dina. I mean, this is going to be a continuing conversation. To Margot and to Bella, I'd like to ask a slightly different version of that question, which is also appearing in the chat. How do we confront power in this moment of increased militarism and violence? So to you, Margot, and then to Bella.
I want to answer a slightly different, respond to a slightly different point, right? And I want to start by jumping on the first question you asked about be seen and if our work is seen and if the work matters. And I think one of the questions here is, who do you want to see our work, right? And who do you want our work to matter for? So that's something. The other thing is I've been thinking, particularly in response to Alda's point, you know, with all due respect to everybody on this panel, I think if we put our brains together in one day, we could come up with a pretty comprehensive analysis, right, of what's happening, because all of us are situated in different parts of the world. If we put all those understandings together, we could have the analysis. I think in some ways, that's the easier part. We're trying to be rational in a situation globally that is not rational, right? And so the question for us as feminists and activists and scholars, whoever we are, is to try to understand what are the longings and yearnings of people in this moment, right? That has some of us voting for the right-wing parties, or that has some of us saying, I don't, by us, I'm not necessarily talking about feminists here, I'm talking about, you know, in the bigger sense, right? That has, you know, doing things that absolutely go against what seems like on the surface against their interests, right? So how do we, as women's movement partners, actors, scholars, get to a deeper understanding of the yearnings and longings? Because I think unless we somehow reach those, right, we can have the best analyses in the world, you know, the best challenges to power, but we're not going to be able to get to the core of the malaise, which the virus is just one example of. That's not, from my perspective, the deepest virus that we need to address. So I'm sorry I didn't answer your question, Shireen. I think, yeah, we have the analyses. We just need to get together to talk about those. We need to have a deeper understanding of what our people, whoever our people are, and what the, you know, the yearnings, right? The things that really motivate people to do the kinds of things they're doing.
Great,
Or
thanks.
not doing.
And it's a conversation, so you are, you know, absolutely fine to move in the direction that you feel is going to feed the conversation. Bella. And sun coming through.
Yeah, it's sunset at home, Sherry. I don't have all the answers, but I have maybe 2 things to contribute, perhaps 3. And I want to say that it is very clear to me that as citizens of the world, we are not required to cooperate with any system that wants us dead. That's all I have to say. That I'm not required as a citizen of the world to be obedient to any form of injustice and oppression. And let me explain that. If my government tells me to wash my hands with running water for 20 minutes using soap, and I cannot afford soap, and my government doesn't deliver water to me, I'm not required to be obedient to that message. So my power actually comes from resisting nonsense. Yeah. And I think that's what we need to acknowledge, that this is a time to really resist nonsense.
Can I just throw in a question here? Bella, if this is a time resonance, then what are you saying yes to? Just a rhetorical question, right?
Okay, Bella, you can live with that question for a bit. And we will find a way to connect to you after this to get your answer once it comes. Alda, over to you.
¿Cuál pregunta? Entonces, la misma de...
Should I answer the same question, Shireen?
Yes, answer the same question. Why not?
Creo que es importante que encontremos un balance entre...
I think it's important for us to find a balance between the rational and the emotional, our dreams, the needs of our heart. This balance is important because people who are in power are hyper-rational. And therefore, we can't face these challenges only with dreams. We have to find a balance that allows us to continue dreaming. Yes, I would say dreams. Our dreams and our yearnings. It's important to continue dreaming, even when we have to be very rational, when we are challenging the power of the 1%. The power of the majority of people is enormous, but the majority of people, at least in my region, are not aware. They're so disempowered as a result of poverty, militarization, the pandemic, the patriarchy. Which means that people are not awake, to say it that way, not aware, not conscious of what's happening. And so us as feminists, we have to contribute to wake people up, to wake up the majority of people. I'm not saying that I have all the truth or that feminists have all the truth and all the answers, but what I'm saying is, what can we do as feminists who understand how patriarchy works in order to share that point of view and that perspective about how it works with other people who have not read any of our documents or read any of our analyses? The patriarchy is completely invisible to them. They think that that's just how life is. As they tell us in the Catholic Church, that is the cross that you must bear. So if your husband hits you, that is the cross you must bear. That's how you will be allowed into heaven. You won't change anything because that's how you will reach heaven, and heaven is so beautiful. That's what they tell us in church. So I think it's very important. And it's something that I struggle with all the time. My wish, my desire is to live more in my spirituality, to participate in rituals. But on the other hand, I think that's not the only solution. I also have to use my rational side to fight against that 1%. And I'm going to take advantage of the floor to say that soon we will have a webinar where I will invite all of you. We will talk about the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. If the states, if governments met the requirements established there, then this pandemic would not have happened, if those conditions had been observed and respected. There's language there that helps us to speak with the whole world. It's not just my spirituality, which might be very different to that of other people. The language that we have here and that we'll discuss in that webinar helps us to understand that if we had followed those guidelines, we would not be in this situation. And now, just to finish, something that I also think is very important.
Alda, sorry, you have 1 minute. Okay.
Quite on the words that we use, because if we say non-paid work, I don't like using that phrase, because that means that only paid work is valuable. How can we change our vocabulary to ensure that we value all work, women's work, and not imply that just because it's not paid, it's bad or deficient? It's important to change the focus through our vocabulary from the market to care, to taking care of each other. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Alda. I'm very aware of time, and we want to be respectful of your time too. And so as we come to the close of this conversation, I'm in no shape or form going to provide a summary, because it is a conversation, right? Instead, I'd really like to invite you to allow the voices of Alda, of Margot, of Dina, and of Bella to sit with you and to resonate, and, you know, to invite you to continue this conversation in your own spaces, via our online spaces, you know, because this is what's important as we begin to think through the nuts and bolts of strategy as well as action moving forward. It's been a real gift to be in conversation with friends. So Dina, Alda, Bella, Margot, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, and for your work. I'd also like to, before we close, give a shout out to the amazing behind the scenes crew. For those of you who are on the front end, we have a team of people who have worked tirelessly to be able to support us to have this amazing space and to ensure that it is safe. So thank you to all of those who have worked behind the scenes. And I'd like to close by sharing a snippet of a poem that a friend of mine shared with me, and has just been really resonant for me. It's called Our Elders, and it's by somebody called Adam Horowitz, and it was written in March 2020. And there's a part of the poem that reads, "This is an invitation to take the river stones from your pocket and put them on the community altar. Not because we're expecting perfect words of wisdom, but because in this unraveling of the world, we are reweaving the village, and you have a role to play. Listen in and know that we're listening too. Know that we're seated in the circle together, that we need you to stay and want to hear what you have to say." And so with those words, I'd like to thank you. Stay safe, be well. We will have a resource page that will reflect the proceedings of this dialogue, as well as some other resources in the next couple of days. So look out for that. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Me tocas y me hunden las olas y me hunde la lluvia. Me besas, sueño y miel en mi boca, sueño y miel en la ropa.